Hey there, Space Maggots, American Ben here. I know you were expecting Alan for this video, but he couldn't do it because, well, he's in the Space Force Reserves, and he has been called upon to join the fight in space as a consultant to a Marine regiment that has to go up against Xenodolphins. I'm very worried about his safety, so please wish him well in the comments. He really worked hard on the research and script for this video and was excited to do it. So I will present it for him, but this is entirely his words. So without further ado, friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Films. My name is Alan. Today we continue on to our last entry in our Best Space Marine series, with the universe most commonly associated with the term Warhammer 40K. Now, after some serious consideration, we've decided not to use the Astartes, because as many of you guys have stated, they are simply too overpowered. For the most part, each of the soldiers we've looked at so far are human, and relatively standard units that are not considered elite or special forces. No ODST, Spartan 2s, or clone commandos. The Space Marines and their heavy genetic modification, including multiple organ transplants, a secondary heart being one of the milder operations they receive, along with the heavy exoskeleton suits, are not only hardly human, but the equivalent of special forces walking gods. So instead of keeping with the theme of this series, we will be looking at the rank and file Imperial Guard, the basic infantry force of the Imperium of Man. Minus a few prosthetics from missing limbs and some minor genetic alterations, the Guardsmen were as human as you can get in this universe. A universe which many people seem to tie our own humanity first message with. The difference being we seek to elevate humanity in order to ensure our survival, whereas 40K is a celebration. A desperate celebration of man. Perhaps not the most powerful of beings in the extreme 40K galaxy, or any galaxy for that matter, but able to survive and even thrive against insurmountable odds and threats through pure determination and grit. But only through the mass dehumanization of man, which is quite the hypocrisy and heresy for me to even mention. Anyway, like with all of the videos in this series, we'll be looking at the flaws and advantages of the force in question. But what makes the universe of 40K different is those flaws and advantages are greatly exaggerated. So today we start by looking at the flaws of Astra Militarum. The first flaw is inconsistency. The Astra Militarum is by far one of the largest military organizations we've looked at so far. The 40K version of our Milky Way galaxy is completely full of hostile Xenos and constant warfare. Travel and communication throughout the vast Imperium of Man is difficult and fraught with dangers. In order to achieve faster than light speeds in this galaxy, one must go through the warp, an extra-dimensional sea of chaos made up of the twisted reflections of sentient beings in normal space. Kind of like the comment section of a YouTube video. Should these extremely malevolent energies pierce the protective bubbles around vessels traveling through the warp, disaster will fall upon the crew as they descend into madness and start murdering and probably eating each other. Which is why faster than light travel is not taken lightly in 40K. This also means that it's relatively hard from a logistical standpoint to centralize and standardize military operations. There is no standard uniform or armor that is being produced in some central forge world. Because the members of a regiment of Astra Militarum are usually recruited from one world, it heavily depends on that world or the surrounding planets what kind of equipment and weapons they're given. The Departmentum Unitorum, the logistical body of the Imperium of Man, is comically overworked and needs to prioritize certain things over others. This means making sure a planet meets their tithe, usually paid in resources or regiments of guardsmen, is far more important to what color those guardsmen's tunics are. In general, the only thing that is consistent among all Imperial Guard regiments is that they are equipped with some form of lasgun. The next flaw is feudal regiments. Since this video is covering flaws and not advantages, we'll be looking at some of the weaker regiments. Some worlds in the Imperium are deemed unfit for the introduction of modern technology. These feudalistic worlds are usually stuck with pre-industrial tech and social structures and are geared towards agricultural production. While these worlds are generally pleasant compared to, say, massive hive cities, they have very little to offer besides manpower. And for many of these feudal guardsmen, seeing the rest of the galaxy might be a shock. It'll be hard enough for them to grasp how electricity works, let alone operate a tank. Although in their defense, depending on their background, they can make great mounted warriors, and luckily tactics in Warhammer 40K haven't changed much since feudal times. Sometimes Imperial Guardsmen units will be deployed to feudal colonies for extended periods of time, and because of the lack of reinforcements and resupply, they will have to locally source materials, which leads to some comically low-tech Guardsmen units armed with primitive gunpowder weapons or single-fire las guns called laslocks. Although some of these mounted warriors can actually be quite fearsome, riding almost any animal imaginable depending on the local world. I begrudgingly concede it might even be possible that some Imperial Guardsmen ride dolphins into aquatic battles. Possible, yes, but it doesn't mean I have to like it or support it. The next flaw is feral worlds. Feral worlds are usually the result of a failed colony or some terrible tragedy, and the inhabitants of these worlds are even more low-tech and generally live in nomadic tribes. While most of the Imperium of Man worships the Emperor as God King, these nomadic tribes, upon seeing a Space Marine or Imperium warship, might think the gods themselves were descending on their planets. Gods, or whatever kind of primitive beliefs they have. Good luck teaching them to use a lasgun. They'll probably just use it as a club. But in their defense, humans on feral worlds are generally in constant survival mode, without the comforts of technology, civilization, farming, permanent walls, or showers. This made them tougher than your average guardsman. The next flaw is penal legions. If you haven't figured it out already, the world of Warhammer 40K is a dark and terrible place without hope. And perhaps one of the darkest places an Imperial Guardsman can find himself is in a penal legion. Capital punishment in the Imperium of Man is quick, swift, and common. A penal colony is a good alternative to death, and also a good way for rapists, murderers, thieves, and deserters to pay for their sins. Because these legions have a higher percentage of sociopaths and dirtbags than normal legions, a lot of things need to be done to ensure their discipline and loyalty. This includes drugs, explosive collars, and even some good old-fashioned whips or light machine gun fire to arouse the penal mass to rise as hard soldiers. Although tactics aren't really much of a thing in this galaxy, the penal legions generally were just cannon fodder, and were set loose on the battlefield to wear down enemy weapons with their bodies. At best, you could strap some explosives onto them, making them like guided missiles, except slower and incapable of flight. Penal squads are usually led, or let's say accompanied, by arbitrators, who in this scenario are like prison guards, except the prisoners also have weapons. You'll notice that these weaker, well, I wouldn't say weaker, but perhaps more troubled units have one thing going for them, and that's sheer numbers. On an individual level, or on smaller, more sensitive missions, they're basically useless. But that's because there is no such thing as small in this universe. The next flaw is communication. So the specific worlds in the Imperial Guardsmen we've spoken of so far represent the objectively weaker regiments compared to some of the more elite ones. But one thing that remains a problem throughout the entire Imperium of Man is communication. As we stated before, the warp swallows up legions of men, fleets of warships, and the messages they carry with them. Where an Imperial Guardsman is deployed is technically determined by the Lord Commander of their segmentum, of which there are 5 in total, who together lead the entire Astra Militarum. But with the lack of instantaneous communication or even reliable communication, it's often left up to sector officers and individual regiment leaders to decide, usually generals or similarly ranked officers. This makes everything from basic logistics to even finding out if a battle is won or lost quite difficult. So once again, the best way for the Imperium of Man to ensure victory is through massive numbers against the enemy, and in extreme situations to deploy the Adeptus Astartes. The next flaw is lack of technological advancement. The Imperium of Man is all about brawn and power, not smarts or efficiency. While the might of the Imperium of Man is awe-inspiring, it's stuck in a constant dark age, where information, thought, and communication are not free-flowing. This is why the same empire can have feudal worlds, and forge worlds where entire fleets of interstellar battleships are created. The restrictive culture and cult of worship surrounding the Emperor keeps humanity relatively safe as a whole, but severely restricts any kind of technological development or advancement. I mean, why the hell send your messages and ships into what is essentially a gateway to hell continuously for thousands of years? To be fair, there are mind-boggling war machines in the Warhammer universe, and the bio-augmentation of the Astartes involves some of the most advanced and gruesome medical procedures I've ever seen in science fiction. The next flaw is no hope. This one has to do with the mindset of the Empire. This will be heresy, mind you, but the God King, as heroic as he is, keeps the collective head of humanity barely above the waterline. In the Warhammer 40K universe, there is no such thing as hope in this life. The individual has no worth, and there lies no greater future for a man than service to the Empire. This terrible reality restricts not only technology, but innovation of another kind. The day-to-day problem solving that allows the UNSC Marines, for instance, to occasionally win a fight against the Covenant. The individual thought that allows a genetically programmed clone to turn against his traitorous general is just missing in the Imperium of Man. You have units like the Death Corps of Krieg charge into battle, disregarding their own safety so much that their commissars find their roles reversed and must temper their own men's wish to die. There is nothing glorious about this hellish battlefield where humanity loses the very thing that makes them human. The next flaw is strategy. History has shown us that armies of free men can and will usually win against the conscripts of despots and dictators. From the Greek city-states and their heroic stand against the Persian Empire, to the swift and shocking defeat of Saddam Hussein's army in the First Gulf War. It takes a veteran to understand that no grand battle plan ever survives the chaos of warfare. In the last episode, we praised the terrific NCO Corps of the UNSC Marines. When the traditional command structure was destroyed and even the most junior officers wiped out, it was up to these NCOs to pick up the pieces and lead companies that had suffered massive casualties. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't heroic NCOs and officers in the Astra Militarum, but there is so little that one officer can do when the entire strategy of your army involves either holding fortifications or charging en masse at the enemy. The next flaw is combined arms. An event known as the Horus Heresy caused a devastating civil war far more dangerous to humanity than any Xeno threat. It also led to the dissolution of the organization known as the Imperial Army into two separate branches, the Imperial Navy and Imperial Guard. This meant that the Imperial Guard lost control of warships and were focused on ground forces. The commissars were introduced as political and religious officers who ensured loyalty and watched out for signs of chaos's corruption. Regiments were further limited by the types of weapons and vehicles at their disposal. Individual regiments rarely had all the pieces of modern fighting forces, and depended on each other to wage full-spectrum warfare with a lot of artillery, shock troops, cavalry, and air support. These measures were enacted to ensure that no single unit of the Guard would become an effective fighting force by itself. Self-sabotage, some might call it, but given the terrible strife and destruction created by the Horus Heresy, it's understandable. The last flaw is infighting. Although all Imperial worlds worship the God King in their own way, the cultures of each world differ greatly. In larger campaigns, when many different guardsmen regiments are gathered together, there can be a clash of cultures. A human from a feudal world has very little in common with a Cadian shock trooper. Their belief systems might also be widely different. Some more backwards worlds might view the Emperor as some celestial body in the sky and have problems with another world that worships the physical man. The unity of man and the forces of the Imperium only happen through the sheer will of the Emperor and the terrifying monsters that humanity must face. So guys, those are the flaws of the Imperial Guard. Please rate them in the top right corner and let us know what you think. Remember, you will get another chance to do so after the 10 advantages video. Anyway, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of this series. And check out our Facebook so you can stay up to date with the Space Marine scores as we release them. And as usual guys, thanks for joining us today. My name is Alan, reminding you that life's a movie and you are the protagonist.